What is up, Buff Nation? I'm here with my guy, Ted Chalfen, a.k.a. the Ghost of Marv, a.k.a. the esteemed author of Folsom's First Century series we're running on DNVR.com right now. If you haven't already, check it out. We're four parts deep.
Yep.
Going through a lot of stuff that even I didn't know about Folsom Field. And one last thing I have to say about Ted before I allow you to start talking. The other day, I was talking to someone about Matt McChesney.
Right.
And someone had called into question how good of a fan he was. And I said to them, there are 3 people in the world that I believe to be as much of a fan as I am. I didn't go through who all they were, but
Right.
I said one of them is Matt McChesney.
Right.
And one of them is you.
Aw.
And then the other one is my original co-host, Bryce Badwin, a.k.a.
B-Bads.
Those are the 3 people in the world that I can say without, I would trust anything that you said to be for the Buffs.
Yes. I can be critical sometimes of some things, and in this article series, we're getting into an area where there were things that CU in the 90s and 2000s, they kind of mismanaged in terms of expanding capacity or adding an IPF, indoor practice facility. So when I say stuff like that, it's always said with love because I want the best for this university. And speaking of B-Bads, I mean, I was on this when it was called the BSN Buffs podcast with you back in 2016, that magical season.
Yep.
I remember the year before that, between classes, listening to you and B-Bads do the BSN Buffs podcast, talking about how they had a chance for a program-defining win against Oregon, and that all these memories come flooding back. So yes, there's some people. Matt McChesney obviously played for the Buffs, so his love should never be called into question. But that means a lot to hear that from you because you have the longest streak of anybody that I'm aware of. You had over 100 games consecutively, 120 almost?
I think it got to 123.
Yeah.
Or 120-ish before I broke it, sadly.
So RK is for anybody out there who may be new or may see a lot of Buffs content in the space now, RK is as OG as it gets. His blood, if you were to open a vein, would be black and gold.
That would actually be sick.
It would be, but I would also probably be concerned. Yeah. But yeah, so Folsom's First Century is something I've wanted to do for years. I am a huge history buff. I'm a huge sports history buff, and I'm a huge Buffs history buff. Yeah, I try. But the Buffs are something that's always been near and dear to my heart. I've written various things about CU history. I used to write for Ralphie Report way back in the day. I did some stuff for them. I've written things here and there over the years.
Coach Prime would say, Ralphie has a report?
Exactly. They were so happy. Those guys were so happy about that. They weren't offended at all. They were like, this is the coolest thing that's happened to us.
It's much better than when Herm Edwards said,
oh, yeah, Devil's Digest.
Devil's Digest. We
Right.
don't want devils around here.
That was a sign that whole thing wasn't going to work out.
Opening press
But
conference.
anyway, I've been wanting to write this because I knew the 100th anniversary was coming up. I was planning on doing it next season when it was actually going to be 100 years. But when I saw that CU was doing their celebrations this year, I decided, with some advice from RK, that let's just strike while the iron is hot and let's do this. So my sources for this were, there's 3 books written by Fred Casati, who used to be the sports information director for CU. Yep. CU Century, which came out in 1989, the Golden Buffaloes in 1980, and then Football CU Style in 1972. If you want to know anything about the Buffs before the glory years of Bill McCartney, those are the books that you need to get. Those will tell you everything you need to know. So a lot of my information comes from that. I also looked up newspaper sources where I could, but unfortunately the Daily Camera and the Denver Post only have stuff on microfilm until about the late 80s. So I was relying on some small town papers that have been digitized and stuff, but okay. I did a lot of digging. And then Stuart Whitehair, I would say, who runs cuatthegame.com, would be my choice for probably the most dyed-in-the-wool CU fan that I know, because he was a student starting in 1980 when the team was awful, and has chronicled every single game since 1980 on his website. And so if you want to know what the reaction was at the time, you got to go read that, because these are all written from his first-person perspective. So that's Fred Casati and Stuart Whitehair, and obviously Dave Platty's done a great job putting together the media guides. But Casati's books Stuart Whitehair's seeyouatthegame.com. If you really want to know more than what my series is about, those are the sources that you need to go to.
I always wonder, like, do other places have this when it comes to see you at the game? Like, do other teams have this? Are we just so blessed that Stuart decided to do this? I don't know. Like, it's one of the coolest things ever, because I'll just be sitting there randomly thinking one day, like, oh, remember the lightning strike game against CSU?
Right.
And then I'll just like go to his website, read the thing. It'll be like, have like a quote from Barnett that I didn't remember.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, this is so sick.
It's a truly wonderful resource. And I'm going to ask him, I've used a couple of his images that he's taken for this series. And I'm going to ask him in December, when I reveal my list of the 25 greatest games in Folsom's history to this point, I'm going to ask him to do a list of the greatest games that he's personally attended, because he's been to hundreds. And I'm also going to ask you to do a list, because out of those 123 consecutive games, I bet you could pick a pretty interesting top 10. And everybody's list is subjective. And I would be so interested to hear yours and to compare and contrast some of the games that we were at together. I haven't been to nearly as many as you have, but I think that would be really interesting, because you can't have a definitive list, right?
I know. It's so funny. And I will definitely be using Stuart's website when I do that, to be like, okay, I just need to remember like what the setting was, this, that, and the other. The crazy thing, I don't even know if I should admit this, but you asked me a couple weeks ago, what was the first game you've been to? And I don't know for sure.
Yeah.
Because 62-36 is when I say like that's when it all began for me. But that was not my first game.
Right.
I had been to games before that and like loved it, to the point where I remember the season of 62-36 is when my mom met my now stepdad, and he had season tickets, and I remember being like, that's the coolest thing ever. So I was already like in, and I really wanted to go to more games, but I just don't know. I told you, I think it might have been against Kansas State, but it's so weird. Like, I was just too young.
Sense. I think there was a pretty big game in '98 when they were ranked 14th and Kansas State was ranked 5th, and they lost to Kansas State, but they were like, that was the biggest game that year, and you would have been 6.
Yeah.
And that was a pretty decent age to remember or go to your first game. I was talking to my friend Matt Hansen. His first game was the 2001 Rocky Mountain Showdown in Denver. He was 6. My first Buffs game was not until I was 8. It was the 2003 Kansas game, which was an overtime game, although I don't think it's going to be on my list, because context is so important. That was like a team that was going nowhere, really. Yeah. And that was one of the only wins they had, the conference part of that season. So it's going to be a tough list, because one thing I want to get into is we have this wonderful resource of Stuart's recaps. We don't have TV coverage for anything before like the 1980s, with one or two exceptions.
Yep.
It's so hard to compare something where you're just reading about it compared to something you can actually see or hear with your own eyes and your own ears. So the list is definitely going to be biased towards things that people probably remember. There's going to be a lot of games from the 80s and 90s on there, but I'm trying to do my due diligence here and make sure that we include some games from eras that don't get talked about a lot, because there's a lot of history that just isn't as well documented. So I think it's going to be a really interesting list. I haven't made it yet. I can tell you that the battle for number 1 is between the 1989 Nebraska game and 62-36. And at this moment, I cannot tell you which one is going to come out on top.
Wow, that's actually a nice little tease.
Yeah.
Nice little tease. Okay, so you've been diving into all of this history, all of these books, all of these sources about Folsom. Speaking of lists, give me a list of like some of the most interesting things you've learned that maybe most people don't know.
Right. Well, the most interesting thing that I learned is that I think we owe the greatest tradition in college sports, Ralphie's run before the game, to the design of Folsom Field. Folsom Field used to have a running track around it, and there was a lot more space on the sidelines than there is now. Ralphie's first season was 1966, and there had been other Buffalo. There was a Buffalo called Mr. Chips, which presages our very own Chip, and there was an unnamed Buffalo that they had at the first game where they were called the Buffaloes in 1934, which was a pretty big game in itself. They beat Utah for the first time in a decade and won a conference title because of it.
No name ever.
What?
The Buffalo was never
The Buffalo
given a
was
name.
not named. If
How
it was,
does that happen?
I guess people didn't care about animals as much back then. But by the 1966, Ralphie had a name, and she was walked around the running track during the game, kind of the way that they parade Bevo around or Cam the Ram or any other live mascot that's not as cool. And that was all they did. And then the next year, Folsom was expanded, not up, but down. They dug out about 20 feet and lowered the stands down about 10 rows so that it comes right down to the sideline as you see today. They added about 5,000 seats that way. What did that mean? There was no space on the sideline for Ralphie to go anywhere. So I think that tradition could have been a one-off and died out just like the other Buffalo that they had before Ralphie. But somebody had the ingenious idea to say, well, if we can't have her go around the field, why don't we run her on the field before the game? And that's why Ralphie 1 starts in 1966, but the first Ralphie run was not until 1967. Nobody has confirmed this to me, but looking at all the information, that's absolutely what happened.
I love it. I love the theory. I love that there's someone like you who's even having a theory about this.
Yeah, I had never had any thoughts about it until I did this, and I looked at the pictures, and I was like, oh my gosh, that's why this happened. It was quite a eureka moment.
Also, Unnamed Buffalo, great name for a bar or a band.
Unnamed Buffalo, yeah. Buffalo to be named later.
Yes.
Traded for Buffalo to be named later.
There was the No Name Bar in Boulder.
That's before my time.
Okay, well,
I guess.
It existed. You probably just didn't know about it. This wasn't well branded.
Yeah, maybe if it had had a name.
But I'm just going to now believe that bar was not actually named No Name Bar. It was named after the Buffalo without a name.
Yeah, I've been through the desert on a buffalo with no name.
There you go.
Could have been a number one.
Okay, that's great. What else?
Yeah. What else? That's definitely the most interesting one. One of the things I learned doing a lot of my research was things that I knew about had been like bandied about for a while were actually being bandied about way before my time. Like Bill McCartney wanted a practice bubble for the team in 1991. They didn't get it until 2007. Rick Neuheisel wanted a full indoor practice facility in 1997. They didn't get it until 2015. So when you start to look at like what happened to the Buffs, yes, there was a succession of poor hires that were made, but also there was definitely a lack of commitment to devoting the resources and raising the money that persisted for a long time, maybe 2 decades.
Yep.
And I think that Rick George raising the money to get the Champions Center built was like a complete paradigm shift. When he talks about hiring Coach Prime as are we going to put up or shut up, play with the big boys moment, the Champions Center was another moment like that. And I don't think you get Coach Prime without the Champions Center. I don't think there's any way.
No way.
And so, yes, it was written into Mike McIntyre's contract by Mike Bone, the previous AD, that they had to raise the money to build the thing or McIntyre could leave with no penalty. Mm-hmm. But Rick George was the one who raised the money. And
Absolutely.
So there were proposals that just went unbuilt for a long time. And so actually getting that done and seeing how long of a process that was, it was kind of agonizing to see like how they were at the pinnacle of success in the 90s and people actually did have the foresight. Like Dick Tharp, the AD in the 90s, wanted an IPF. Rick Neuheisel wanted an IPF, but there weren't the people there to actually make it happen. And so that was something that was kind of difficult, but I'm happy that we have the Champions Center and the IPF now, and look what it's helped do for us.
And I feel like I talk about this so much, but it's really important to me. Like, this is why the 5430 Foundation exists now. Because it's like college athletics and the success within them is so connected to the donors of that program and staying by it. So like, whatever the next thing is,
right,
it has to start now.
Exactly. And, Terry Frey of the Denver Post wrote in 1997, and I quoted in the article, it's not about 1997, it's about 2002 and beyond. And he was right. So, yeah, the 5430 Foundation, if you want the Buffs to be competitive in 2027,
yep.
I'm not going to do a PSA right now, but you know what I mean?
Yeah,
I'm just going to leave it there.
It's one of those things. It's just like, that is how it works.
The game changes.
Yep. Okay, so with that in mind, anything you want to talk about that's coming up in part 5, part 6 that you're excited about?
I mostly talked about it. It's the battle to get the Champions Center finally built.
Okay.
That's a big one. And then in part 6, which I haven't written yet, I'm going to get a chance to talk about my time as a student, which will be fun.
Nice.
To actually relive some of those memories and the 2016 season, which was the most fun I've ever had, at least until this year, being a CU fan. And it was just that much more special because I was a senior in college. And student section leader and doing this podcast with you and all of that. So that'll be really fun to kind of relive. And then I also get to talking about the future, about how Folsom Field has always been evolving and changing, and it is going to continue to do that. Mm-hmm. They are going to announce plans for a West Side renovation.
Yes.
We haven't seen renderings yet, but I've been told by a source on the inside that I'm probably going to like it.
I love that.
I think that they're going to not do something completely out of character with the stadium or the architecture. So hopefully it's going to look cool. There's been a lot of talk about expanding the stadium this year with all of our sellouts, and that's something that I want to talk about.
Really quick on the West Side renovation.
Yeah.
I said this on the show last week when we were talking about it. I'm excited for it, but I'm also just so attached to Folsom that like I said to the guys, I was like, if they changed nothing ever, I wouldn't care.
Right.
Like
me too.
Like I don't
keep the troughs.
Yes.
I never like to sit during a game, so I don't need seats with cup holders and chair backs and all of that. Like I prefer to stand anyway.
Yep.
That's one thing that changed this year is the greatest loophole in college sports is now gone because the support is so crazy in the student section that you need a student ticket to get in, which you'd think you would have always needed that. But RK and I like to sneak in our adulthood, but that's over now.
Sneaking in is a very intense way of putting it, considering we've just been walking in.
Yeah, well, nobody
years.
cared.
Yeah,
nobody
exactly.
cared.
I talked to you about it. I've said it on the show. I was literally doing that since I was 13 when my sister was in college.
Yeah. My first field rush, and I could talk about it in part 5, was I was 11 years old. It was the Texas Tech game in 2006, the first win of the Dan Hawkins era. I snuck into the student section with my friend in the second half, and we ended up being a part of that field storm.
That is the Baby Blue game, right?
No, I think that was 2009.
Okay, but that was also Texas Tech.
Yes.
Okay.
Maybe it was Texas A&M. Anyway.
Could have been. I don't know.
No, people were still optimistic about Dan Hawkins in 2006.
Okay. So like now I'm having to learn. There's like good and bad. Like I'm actually sitting in my seats, which are in a pretty good spot. And I'm like, I'm becoming that person who's like friends with all of the people in their section. It's like a very adult thing to do. Like,
it's like, oh yes, Connie, good to see you again. Exactly. Oh yes, Jim, hi.
Yeah, everyone walks in, but the good thing is, they all just like buy me drinks.
Well, they should. I mean, you're like one of the biggest flag wavers for this program.
I don't even know if it's about that though. It's just like a camaraderie of the section thing. Like, hey, I'm going to get a drink. You want one? It's like,
that's true.
Yeah,
that's true.
These guys next to me, like, know someone in the stadium. They just get like cardboard boxes full of drinks delivered to them.
Wow.
I know.
That's definitely living right.
Yes.
But you can't probably stand the whole game. Although this year people have been standing for pretty much the whole game.
It's like 70-30.
Yeah.
Which is pretty good.
Yeah.
Which is pretty good. Okay.
So yeah.
Attendance.
Well, obviously this year the Buffs have set a record with selling out every game. Previously, they had never sold out every game in a season. Which is kind of crazy when you think about it, how good
Really
they were in the 90s. They would sell out like all their conference games, but they'd play Northeast Louisiana State or whatever, and they would have 48,000 people in there, the 94, 95. Like that was just the way it was.
Yep.
Boulder's always been an interesting market. It's had moments of intense passion for the Buffs. The early 70s was something I cover. They expanded the stadium and they sold out all the season tickets, and they almost sold out every game in 1972. But there's also been moments where it's been harder to draw. Now that they're selling out, a lot of people have said, why don't we expand the stadium? I am on team, let's pump the brakes on that for a second, because I think demand is a good thing. And sometimes perception of a scarcity can do things like create higher ticket prices, which create more revenue. You don't want a problem where you're having to discount tickets or try to give them away. Now, that's not a problem that you're going to have the next couple of years, but I tend to take a long view of things. I am so hopeful that the demand for this program will be where it is right now in 5 years and in 10 years and whenever Coach Prime decides to retire. But I don't know that for sure, and I just tend to be a cautious type. However,
can confirm.
I have one proposal that is a bit sacrilegious, but I think would improve everything about the way that the concessions work in the stadium.
Oh.
Everything about the way that, like, the scoreboards, which I think we're getting a new scoreboard next year anyway, but this would probably allow you to put a bigger one. It's a bit sacrilegious, though. You know, our south end zone.
Mm-hmm.
The point after which the club level stops and where it gets small, like half the height, I would completely demolish that.
The whole south side?
The whole south, because remember, Folsom's built into the ground. So the first level, you don't do that. You demolish the part that's above ground.
Oh, okay.
And then you build differently than you built. You know how there's all that empty space underneath the club level where we have the concourse now on the east side? You build something.
Yes.
You build up like that so that it matches the height.
And then you build underneath.
And then you build your concessions and everything like that, where there's currently no amenities whatsoever in that south end zone. You build them there. And doing that, you don't actually block the view of the mountains if you build up that high, at least not unless you're in like the first like 5 rows, which you don't have much of a view anyway. And then you could have more bathrooms, more concessions, and you could fit a scoreboard in there that wouldn't be a huge like thing tacked on top. You can have it in the top part of that addition without raising the overall profile. And that would probably get you another 5,000-10,000 seats. That's the only way I would do it.
I think it's a good idea. And I just go back to what I said earlier. Like, it would be like when you're talking about like CU changing uniforms.
Right.
And it's like, you could do something really cool.
Right.
But you could also just mess up something that's perfect.
They have done some really cool things this year that we've, like the gold face mask, the gold uniforms that they did in the first game with the gold lettering.
Wait till you see what they're wearing this week.
Ooh, that's a nice tease. But they've also done some things I wasn't crazy about. The Nebraska uniforms I wasn't crazy about. But like, it can be good. I am shocked that I arrived at that conclusion because I'm Mr. Tradition.
Yeah.
But the way that I look at it, you'd still have a piece of that original 1956 facade on the east side. Like, that's not going anywhere.
Right.
But then you could just open it up. You could build a nice new facade, and it wouldn't really build out too far towards the street. Like, if you think about it, you could actually keep it pretty much within where it is now. But you just have space underneath.
Yeah, right. So you're basically just getting that same effect of like a tunnel that goes on. I mean, it makes sense functionally.
Because they're going to that's what they're going to do on the west side, I think, is something like that. I think it's going to be a pass-through.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah.
So you could just wrap the whole thing.
That's what I would do.
How do you feel about closing in the northwest side?
It's fine. They can do that. If they want to turn that into another club area, that's fine.
That's what I would do. I think those seats that are the furthest part of that side of the west side of the stadium, so the furthest north seats, are the only bad seats that exist in Folsom.
But that's why we give them to the visitors. So then where do you put the visitors? That's the only problem.
Well, you could still put them over in that corner, but it would just look better, and you wouldn't have a situation where like there's only like a couple seats where you're actually far away from the field, and they're those.
Yeah, but that's why we don't sit there. That's why we put the Nebraska fans there.
Totally, and I'm in on that.
And by the way, gosh, that was wonderful how few there were. They were just in those two little sections mostly, and then they were kind of scattered. It was such a nice change.
And somehow they messed up the colors on TV where it made it look like there was a ton of red.
It's because of red. Red just pops. You know, when you see the Broncos game, the orange just pops.
Yep.
It's unfortunate, but being in the building, it was great.
I felt like I was, I don't know, like talking politics because one side was just like so dug in. They're like, no, I can see it. There's red in the stadium. And I'm like posting videos from my seat like, no, look, this is what it really looks like.
Yep. Oh, well.
Yeah.
In the end, 36-14.
Amen.
Three in a row.
All right, man. Thanks for coming in. Appreciate you.
Appreciate you, man.
Make sure you guys stay tuned to the DNVR.com for the rest of Ted's series on Folsom. I can't wait to see it finish.